Hello, good morning. Thank you so much for accepting our request for interview, Lynn, Dr. Lynn Wang. We're very honored to be here to have a conversation with you. Today is March 1st, 2022. To start off, can you tell us where were you born?
Thank you. And first, just please call me Lynn, not a doctor. I was born in Saigon in Vietnam. I'm a child of the 60s.
I see. And did you go to, can you tell us a little bit about your childhood, your schooling?
Sure, sure. So my father was in the military. So we traveled quite often and we lived often on military bases because this was during the Vietnam War. So I just went to school in Saigon and in some other places. And up until I was 8, and that was when the Vietnam War came to a culmination, and obviously the northern Vietnamese marched in to Saigon at that time. So we left on the last day before right on the fall of Saigon on April 29th, 1975. And we just grabbed some things. I think a lot of people just never thought it would happen. And so my parents grabbed the three of us children, and we just hopped onto a little PT boat that my dad had, and and we set out to sea, hoping to find a big ship, an American ship that can pick us up. And I hadn't thought about how traumatic that was for a parent until I had my own child. And I just thought, would I have dared to take my child into the open seas like that and with nothing to prepare for? And I think that's really informed my advocacy work as I think about the difference between working with immigrants versus working with refugees. And they might have come from the same background, the same country, but the situation is so different because as a political refugee, as an immigrant, you plan things out, and you may have packed, you may have learned a language, you may have prepared a lot more, but as a refugee, you kind of just grab what was available, and it's a last minute thing because you never intended to leave. So there's quite a bit more trauma, and that really informed my work with the refugee community later on in my life. So we came to the U.S. We were relocated to the refugee camp in Guam, and we were there for a year. And then we were relocated again to one of the military bases in Pennsylvania. And this is a common experience for all of the Vietnamese refugees, the boat people, that we were relocated to different military camps in the US. And there were some, so when we meet somebody, we'll say, well, which camp did you go to? So, I know there's Camp Pendleton, there's Camp Indiantown, West, there's different camps. So anyway, so that's kind of my beginning. And I was in upstate New York. It was very different. It's very cold and no Asian foods, no Asians. It was a very hard adjustment for my parents. I think for us kids, we were younger and it was much easier to adapt and to learn and pick up a new language.
What a powerful story. Going back a little, do you remember how many days were you on the sea? And finally, how did you meet the US military or Navy to bring you to the refugee camp?
I don't remember much about it. I do know that when we went out into the seas and it just got choppier and choppier, and a lot of people got sick. And I understand later that we had all heard that, I mean, the kids didn't know, but my parents and the adults had heard that the Americans were sending ships out to international waters to pick up refugee boats. So we were able to connect to the American tanker. It was a big tanker. They had emptied everything, And so they had a big cargo hold on the bottom, and they were able to just um, connect with all of these little boats floating out. And what I do remember is the rope ladder. I mean, you watch American Ninja, and they always have that rope ladder. And I actually have done that when I was 8 years old, climbing up the rope ladder. And I remember, we had the suitcase of clothes, and of course, somehow in the bringing ourselves up, and somehow we lost our one suitcase of clothes. We lost we actually lost the suitcase of my mom and dad had packed some money, some things that we could use later, and we lost everything. And the only suitcase that they were able to keep track of, and they didn't know which one was which by that time, but the only one that they were able to maintain a hold of was the suitcase with our photo albums. And it was surprising to me that they even brought all the photo albums, because who would bring that when you're a refugee? But apparently that was what they scooped up. And so climbing the rope ladder was very difficult and very scary, because if you've ever been out in the open seas, and the water underneath is just roiling, and the tanker is very, very big. And so you have to climb up a long way, and our little boat is very small. And my mom, who's very nearsighted, in the climb up, and she's not, many Vietnamese women of that generation just were not very physically strong. And she lost her glasses, and she wore these Coke bottle glasses, and she lost them, which was made life very difficult for her, because she was almost literally blind and she couldn't see anything. And to be in a strange environment, to not be able to see anything, is very, very scary for her. And I didn't realize this until much later. But yeah, so we were all on in the bottom in the tanker. So it's in the cargo hold, and it was very, very stuffy. And there were many, many people jammed into there. And we had little sheets given to us. And so each family you had your little space, which was the size of that sheet. And you would just line up. Well, they would serve us, rice that they cooked. And I remember being so hot, and I just remember just craving a glass of iced tea, because we often drank iced tea as a way to cool ourselves in Vietnam, right? So it was, and when we came onto the top, when some of us were allowed to go up to the top for a little bit at a time, just looking down into the waters, I remember it was very, very frightening. And of course, I didn't know how to swim, so it was very scary for me.
Wow. So then coming to the United States, did you stay in the North a long time before coming to Houston?
No. So my parents could only tolerate the upstate weather in New York for 1 year. It was super cold. And my goodness, but we were sponsored by an American family, which was unusual, because many of the refugees were sponsored by churches. So the church members would gather and, contribute money for like an apartment, help them find jobs. But our sponsor was a person who stepped up and said, we will sponsor a refugee family. And it still touches me a lot. So yeah, so we stayed with them actually for 6 months, and they helped my parents find a job. My mom, who was in Vietnam, she was a newspaper reporter, and she was an anchor woman on TV. So she was a columnist. So she was pretty well known. And my father was a major in the army, and he was, high up. He had a lot of people reporting to him. And he ended up working in a furniture factory doing manual labor, just Vermont furniture, because he's very handy. And when you don't have the language, you can do physical labor. And my mom worked as a nurse's aide in a nursing home, because the lady who sponsored us is a nurse. So she brought my mom into there. So basically, as a nurse's aide, you end up emptying bedpans, and you help people bathe people. And so it was very big for them, a big change in life. And, you know, this happened for quite a lot of refugees where your status is suddenly gone. You know, everything is gone. You have no money, you have nothing. So they were able to save and within 6 months, they put some money down and we moved into a trailer park. And, you know, that was the first time I saw anything like that. It's a trailer, it's a house on wheels, and it's a long, skinny house. And so my two brothers shared one room and I slept in the living room. So at night I would bring out my bed stuff and sleep in the living room because there was only two bedrooms and I'm the girl. So there's two boys. So obviously two, you know, it makes more sense for the two boys to share. And my parents had the other room. But it was, you know, it was fun for a year. And my parents found some long distance cousins in Houston and they said, come on down to Houston where it's warmer and there's more Asians, more Vietnamese, and there's Asian food, because it was really hard for my parents to, you know, eat the all of this new food. So we moved down and in an old car and no air conditioning because up north the cars didn't have air conditioning. So we drove down to Houston with this old Ford four-door sedan and it was very old and um, very hot. They didn't tell us about the mosquitoes or the hurricanes. And later on the flooding, but Houston became home from 1976 until now.
That's amazing. Tell us a little bit about the schools you attended in Houston and then eventually how
Yeah.
you chose your career.
Well, so I'll start with the schools in Vietnam. In Vietnam, I was in the third grade. In third grade, we had learned, you know, our multiplication tables already from, you know, up to 12. And we left in April. So towards the end, you know, April 29th, and that was the end of the school year. So we already knew all of our multiplication tables by then. When we got to upstate New York, they put me back in third grade again to learn English. And the upstate New York, they were just learning the multiplication table. So I did it all again. And then when we moved down to Houston, I started fourth grade. They were just learning, they were just learning the multiplication table. So, you know, looking back, I think I contributed to the Asian stereotype that Asians are good at math, but I've had 3 years of multiplication tables. Um, so that is my experience with the schools. And I have to say in the South, school seems to be a little bit behind, at least from my 1 year experience. And but you know, I learned and I got put into you know, the more advanced programs and you know, went to school here from all public school from the fourth to through high school, and went to the University of Houston. And then I went to graduate school at the University of Texas School of Public Health. And, you know, obviously staying in town was kind of expected. I really had wanted to go. I mean, couldn't really consider options because we didn't have the monies. And I didn't even ask my parents. I just knew we didn't have the money. I did apply to the University of Texas and did get accepted, but um, my mother was very worried about sending her only daughter away. So I ended up applying to U of H at the last minute and they accepted me and gave me a full scholarship. So I was, from then on, I went to U of H and graduated from U of H.
Maybe going back a little bit, once you arrived in Houston, what job did your parents find? And do you remember the names of the schools that you attended?
Oh, for sure. I went to Travis Elementary in the Heights. And when I attended that school, the school didn't even have a library. I mean, it was so old. It was already 50 years old. It was celebrated its 50th year when I was there, and that was 40 something years ago, right? And I remember I was in fourth grade there, and the classes were about. It was very similar to the Vietnamese school in the sense that there were about 40 students per class. And I remember in one class, the teacher asked us, what do you want to be when you grow up? And people, almost all the girls said teachers, and almost all the boys said truck driver. And I was the only one who, I was thinking, I'm in fourth grade. I'm 9 years old. I don't know what I want to be. I don't want to be a teacher. I know that. And I don't want to be a truck driver. But I don't know what I want to be. And so I remember just sticking out like a sore thumb because I don't know what, at that time. And then my mom, when she started in Houston, she kind of kept to what she knew, where she worked in a hospital. And she, applied for jobs in a hospital as again as an nurse's aide, emptying bedpans and all of that. And my dad found a job at a tool company, Hughes Tool. And so, he again was able to do manual labor work, but he was very good and very mechanical. And at Hughes Tool, I remember they had a program where, like, if you came up with new ways to do something that saves money, that increases safety or whatever, some new innovative thing that was helpful, then you would get like a cup or something. And he was always getting these cups because he was always thinking about ways to do things differently and make it better. And he loved getting the prizes, just not the cups, but he just loved getting a prize. That was very important to him. And he was always on time. And he actually always showed up early because he likes to come in. He always told us you have to come in early. So he would always showed up to work like 30 minutes early. But then I remember during the 70s, there was an oil crisis and he lost his job and it was really, really tough, and we went through some really hard time. My mom ultimately left the hospital and she worked in a gas station. So as a cashier in a gas station, and thank goodness they had those bulletproof glass because it was quite dangerous to be in a gas station. Um, so she did that for a while and they worked nights. So then we kids would, kind of take care of ourselves. I mean, she cooked for us and left the meals there. We would walk ourselves to school and then we would come back and do our homework. And so we kind of were on our own, just cleaning up and I think about it and I'm thinking, man, she worked and cooked dinner for us and just left it there. And I can't believe we did all of that. And I still remember vacuuming by myself. I mean, it's just something that you did because you had to, you have to do your part to help everybody.
Well, thank you for sharing. These are wonderful, wonderful stories. So then going into U of H, how did you then choose the path that you ultimately chose?
Yeah, I've always been interested in psychology and I wanted to study psychology. And when I told my parents, they were very worried because there's no concept of mental health in our culture at that time. So you were either normal or you were crazy. So if I was studying psychology, I'm obviously not studying normal people. So you're going to study to work with crazy people. That's very dangerous, So they were even embarrassed to tell their cousins, neighbors, friends about what I was studying. And so the words that they used was thin tongue, which is more like mental, something about your mental, cognitive uh, brain thinking. But so yeah, so and I really, and I wanted to get my PhD in psychology and become, like a counselor or a therapist. I didn't want to do research because I didn't even know about research really. And I think, but in my senior year, I found public health. And I thought, actually, I really like the idea of using psychology, learning the concepts of psychology to influence people's behavior to improve health. And that just sort of came about because as we became better and more fluent at English, we ended up just that role, we just slowly transitioned into the role of helping our parents, because in the beginning they helped us with they had a little bit more English than we did. Of course, we had no English, but they had limited English, and they were able to take us to doctors' offices. But when we got older, we were able to, be the interpreters, and we didn't even realize that that is not really cool until later. But we just kind of helped our parents do all the whatever paperwork that needed to be done and interpretations. We did it. So you had this 10-year-old or 12-year-old doing all of this paperwork, and we did it to the best of our abilities. But there were words we didn't know, and I do remember I was invited to apply for one of the schools, T.H. Rogers, because it was one of those, I don't remember what it's called, one of those special schools, not magnet, but
Vanguard.
Vanguard, that's right. So it was a Vanguard school, and my teachers had nominated me, and they sent me an application form, and my dad took me to the test. And on the form, I remember I was filling it out, and I was filling out everything, and there was a section that said race. And I just thought, I don't know that I'm racing anybody. I'm not wearing tennis shoes. I don't know what race they were talking about. And maybe some kind of competition, that's in my mind. I didn't know. So I just left it blank, right? And there were lots of questions, but I answered as best as I could. But back then I was, I think, in fifth grade, and my English was still shaky. I don't know that I answered it well at all, but never heard from them again. So obviously I was in the wrong race. um, but it worked out fine, because then, we moved out into the suburb, and it would have been quite impossible, actually, even if I had been accepted, I think, because we didn't have the resources. Like, my parents could not, they work nights. How could they take me to school? And, it really required that. And so it always makes me aware about, the opportunities that we make available for all of our diverse children in different circumstances. I mean, are they able to play baseball? We talk about the importance of physical education, but how expensive is that? I mean, many swimming ability or inability is one of the biggest health disparities. You look at who drowns and who doesn't know how to swim. 68% of African Americans don't know how to swim. 58% of Asians don't know how to swim. And yet, do they have access to a pool? Do they have access to swimming lessons? No. We don't have these kinds of access, right? So it's very difficult. And how do we even level that playing field when it's so lopsided? I remember my school in the Heights, no library. I went, and then from there we went to the middle school. We didn't have labs. And it wasn't until I went to academic competitions, and we went to Memorial High School, or we went to Bel Air High School, and we were like, oh my gosh, I was shocked that the schools had all of this. How did they have that? And my school had no library. How did that happen? So I'm very aware of when people say to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Do you even have bootstraps? Or are you wearing flip-flops, which we were wearing, right? So it's so an inadequate suggestion, and we have to really get at that base of how do we even make all of these things equitable at the beginning, so people have. And I think that's driven my sense of equity and social justice.
That's very powerful. So then how did you, and I think Hope Clinic would be one of the topics we're very interested in. And I know that we have interviewed Beverly Gore, we've run to Regine Calvert. And so you're one of the godmothers of Hope Clinic. And I think it begins at Asian American Health Services. Am I saying it right? And can you tell us how you met them, how this whole thing began? And we really want to know, everything about it.
Okay, so I was, so from the time I was young, so starting in high school, I started thinking, I just It came from visiting those other schools, seeing the disparities in what the schools had. Even in our high school, we had grass growing on the tennis court. We, and then we go to the other high schools and they had beautifully maintained tennis courts. And then we might even go to a black high school where the tennis courts were, the chain link fence were falling down, even worse than ours. So it really drove me to kind of think about equity. And I realized, even for my own community, the Asian American community, first, there, I knew that there were a lot of health issues. I see, friends and family with health issues. I see people at that time, my parents' age, and they were in their 50s and they didn't have the resources, the language skills. My friends and I were all doing the translations, and we saw that when people went to clinics, you kind of have to take off the entire day, and these are people who work, my parents work for hourly wages. So you take off an entire day, you sit there and you wait, and and it's not just their wages, because my dad would have to drive my mom, and my dad drives my mom to work. And so, you have one car. So everybody, it's a whole family is out because I'm taking off to help translate. And you're there and you don't hear your name called. And then you learn that, oh, wait, it was called an hour ago, but you didn't answer. Well, I didn't know you called because I didn't recognize the way you said my name. It was so completely different. And so I realized that we needed to have a voice. We needed to make people aware, to help people. I mean, because I've always been thinking about, a lot of people think about we need to educate the community. But my perspective has always been we need to educate the providers to understand the population that they're serving better. So I then I was 18 and I went to college. And when I graduated, I got a job at the UT School of Public Health. And I was very interested when I started grad school in health issues. And I started grad school. And in my classes, we learned a lot, we read a lot of uh, manuscripts about, all of the leading thinkers about behavioral theories, about health theories, about, social determinants of health and all of these health theories. And I was so surprised. I remember thinking, theories. So there are theories for why people do things, and these theories. And I've kind of started thinking about, well, how did they come up with these theories? So they came up with the theories basing on other theories and older theories, and then they kept building on these theories. Then I started looking at, but who were they doing their studies on? And it's never people like me. And I'm thinking, well, so how do they know these interventions work for people like me? How do they know that this is how people like me think? People from a different part of the world. I don't think this is accurate for my community. And it kind of really bothered me that there was not I really didn't think things were culturally appropriate, that it wasn't, and not that it was appropriate, but it wasn't relevant. It was not meaningful and it wasn't relevant. And I realized that I'm very pragmatic. I want things that work. I want to improve people's health. I want things that work. I don't want to do research. So that's what I was thinking. So I hadn't even thought about changing the research. And when I left academia, I worked in academia for 2 years. Then I went to work. I got a job at the United Way of the Gulf Coast. And that was an awesome experience because I work in the community planning department. And I was able to, my boss was just this phenomenal man. And he kind of just, I was gung ho and he let me kind of take the ball and go and do stuff that I wanted to do. So I did a lot of community effort, assessments, because the United Way at that time raised like $80 million a year. And how do they allocate it fairly and equitably? And so I managed a lot of community groups. And one year I worked on, I think it was like a couple of years where I did um, community assessment. We decided to do an assessment of communities. And so I did like conducted 78 focus groups in the community by myself. And I read up on how to do focus groups and what to consider and how to even record it and how to do it equitably. And so I just pulled up my public health books and I pulled up how to do focus groups. And I did focus groups, you know, we worked with many different groups. And so we did groups of older African Americans, we do young Asians. So we did many different groups by race, by sex, by ethnicity. And every group was different because how people responded and how people shared. Some didn't share, some waited until after the group to tell me about the gang problems because they didn't want to lose face to share that, you know, my son is in a gang. So it was very, very different. We worked with, you know, African American groups where African American elderly would tell me that, you know, they they live with the grandkids and no, the grandkids' parents were not with them, and the grandkids were selling their medications. So I was, you know, just learning so much about that. And from all of this work, and I was young and I still had a lot of energy, and my boss let me do it. So I said, I think I would like to start a group to talk about Asian health. And so because of the United Way auspices, it was because the United Way allowed me to work during work time, to allocate some work time. But honestly, a lot of these meetings were held at night to accommodate people. But I would write up the results, you know, and write up the notes and send out stuff during my work hours. And that was a lot of work. And it truly was a labor of love for me. And I found the time to do it. But I convened different community members that I had met and invited them to participate. And, you know, we would meet regularly. And, you know, some of the members just really stood out. And I was so lucky to, you know, to meet people like Rogine and Beverly. And I also was learning to navigate the different Asian groups too, because I was coming from the perspective that Asians didn't have a voice, and not just Vietnamese Asians, but Chinese and others. But at that time, I think a lot of people were only looking at within their group. So they were trying to promote the Vietnamese interests or the Chinese interests, and not the interests, but the needs. But, you know, it's much harder because the groups were small. And this is back in the 80s. The, the city of Houston released the Health of Houston documents in the 80s with only Black and white data, not even Hispanic data. And here I'm trying to get Asian data, right? You know, so how crazy was that? So they didn't, you know, include Hispanics until later. And it took a long time to get them to include Asians. And, you know, and partly it's because they had less contact, but less awareness and fewer people in the roles where they can have a voice. So it was really just building that Asian voice. And I, you know, I kind of led the Asian American Health Coalition for quite a while because of the auspices of United Way allowing me to dedicate time to it. And I think that in order for these things to happen, it's, even though I was a volunteer, I attended these night meetings, I did a lot of things on my own, that it cannot, I mean, it makes it so much better when there's one organization that supports that. And I cannot thank the United Way. You know, we're forever indebted to them, and they have been a phenomenal community leaders and supporters. So, you know, I've always been such a big fan of them.
That's amazing. So basically from your work with the United Way, you met Regine and Beverly, and then was the Asian American Health Coalition created after the three of you met and talked and thought you needed a vehicle from which to do all this work?
Well, we actually, I had just started convening many different people together for these regular meetings. And it was through the regular meetings that these voices came out and these personalities came out. And then we became more of a group after the regular meetings were starting. And there were some other people that, you know, are no longer involved with the group. And it was interesting because I was still navigating that, where Vietnamese Americans wanted me to why don't you lead a group for Vietnamese? Why are you doing, just for everybody? And so it's hard, right? Because I think at that time, people still can still say, well, why aren't you doing this? And it makes me think of sometimes even in a family when you volunteer a lot, sometimes they might say, why aren't you helping your family? Why are you helping all these people you don't know? Because it really has to start at home. But you can do both. So I actually did lead the Vietnamese American Community Health Network for a while. And doing that and connecting them to the bigger group and knowing that every community, they do need their own voice. We can't all be one, but we can have individual voices, and then we can join and we can speak together. So we don't, we're not diluted, we're stronger together, but we are also unique and individual. So, just learning that balance. And Regine and Beverly were very unique because they were born here. So, while they are Chinese American in ethnic origin, they do have that more of a bigger mentality. And Regine particularly is so broad-minded in how she thinks, and so her vision is so much broader than um, mine. Just thinking about the capacity and who we need to involve and who we need to pull in, because I'm kind of, sometimes I think more small because I'm thinking, how do I operationalize this? How do I get this done? And she's thinking of all the bigger pieces. So she's truly a strategist. And Beverly was more of the research kind of thinking that we need to kind of do it this way. We need to do it more. We need to really focus on these methodologies to make sure that we're consistent. And Regine has that big picture, and I'm trying to make it, how do we operationalize it? If we were doing this research project, how do we implement? So I spent a lot of my time actually advocating to other groups in California that I had met, just learning about, because they were doing a lot of work in California, like APCHO, supporting the Asian Health Forum. They had so many projects and so much research, and we were very jealous. We wanted some of that resources for Houston. And talked with Jeff Caballero and many people in California. And I remember they had funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to do the opening door study. And Houston was not included in that study. It was multi-site. And I said, but you've got to include Houston. We have nothing for Asians here. So they said, well, so they were kind of going to include Houston, but we would be the control group, where the control group is where there's no interventions done, because they want to keep us naive and simple so that they can compare to a group that has some interventions. And I remember Beverly and Regine and I I think some other people like Jane Shea, Dr. Jane Shea. We were just saying, well, we don't want to be a control group anymore. We want to be the intervention group. We want to bring good things to Houstonians. We want to bring good things to our community. So we knew we had to get data, and that was our big thing, is how do we collect data? How do we go about collecting data? So at least we can describe our communities. And even when I was able to do an internship at the March of Dimes when I graduated from college. And I remember I was able to do maternal health behavior and their beliefs about, the health and kind of services that they used. And I did it with Vietnamese and Chinese. And so, I mean, I've always been able to kind of persuade people, get people excited about what I was excited about. So they have the March of Dimes support on that. And I was actually just I didn't have any skills in this, and I just did it, and they allowed me to do it and funded me to do it. So, having that funding and having that support, Houston's nonprofits are just phenomenal. We have nonprofits even that had a lot of open mindsets, that were very willing to learn and wanting to learn, and knowing that there are gaps and we don't know what these issues are and we want to learn. So that's been wonderful.
That's great. Do you remember what were the years that you met Rogine Beverly and began the whole process?
Gosh, so I am terrible at years. I do know that I worked up until I gave birth, and they gave me a surprise baby shower. So that was 1995. And so I know I met them. So I think I probably met them in the late 80s, because by 1992, we had the first Southeast Asian Health Symposium. And we had, I just try to connect with anybody I could find. And one of the ladies I met was with in Dallas with the public health service in Dallas. And I think her name was Mary Bowers. And just connecting with her, and she was very interested in minority health and women's health, and she was a phenomenal supporter of our group. And when she moved to Washington, we were able to maintain that contact. So so I think it was in the 80s that we did all of this. Um, and then in 1992, we had the first Southeast Asian Health Symposium. And out of that symposium, we had different meeting rooms with focusing on different things. So I was in the data collection meeting room. How do we increase data known, whatever. But it turns out that all of the other rooms tackling all the other topics of Asian health, all of those rooms came up with the one theme that ran through all the rooms was that, well, we need data. We need data to demonstrate that this is an issue. So, that was one of the things that came out, because in order to show that, in order to demonstrate need, we need data. And we had to demonstrate need in order to get services.
So so your group began with collecting data and ways of implementing the collection. What happens, did you get the data, and then what happened after that?
Well, obviously we were able to help the groups to publish the data, but my memory might be wrong on this, but I mean, we knew what the data said, but I don't remember that we disseminated the data, because at that time, I was still, I think, probably just right out of grad school or just in grad school, where I still hadn't really learned much about the importance of dissemination of research data. I was very much interested in getting services to the community. And that was our goal. We always had this shining vision example of, gosh, wouldn't it be awesome? And we actually had visited the health center in California, in Oakland, I think, and knew in New York they had this incredible Chinese health center. We just thought, if we had a health center in Houston where the providers really understood you, where you wouldn't have to come in and tell your whole history and explain your whole culture in order for them to give you relevant care for yourself, wouldn't that be awesome? We just had that vision of having people that can speak the languages of our parents, so that they could get good care, that the providers would understand that, okay, so they're not eating, they're not sleeping, this really sounds like it could possibly look for mental illness, even though they decide they answer negatively to all the questions, but it might be a mental illness issue. I remember at that time, a lot of our Hmongs and our Cambodians had moved down south to the Rosenberg area, the Rosharon, because they are an agricultural community, and they were very traumatized by the war. And I remember there was articles in the paper where it was starting to become noticed that people were dying in their sleep. They seemed to be healthy, and they would go to sleep and they would die. And if that's not psychosomatic, I don't know what is, because they were very traumatized and they couldn't talk about it. There is no mental illness, right? You're crazy or you're healthy, you're normal. And so when they have all of these things happening, who knows it affects you in many ways. And I remember thinking, reading about it and making connections with the Hmong community, connecting with, one of their leaders who was just phenomenal. And she and I became good friends, and just learning about the Cambodian community as well. And so, yeah, just, and working with the refugee communities, because and we would see the refugee communities change throughout the years, depending on where the war was going, and just knowing that I have this connection to them because I've been through it myself. And I just can't imagine, even now, bringing strangers into my house for that I would have a totally different culture, different language, and they don't speak my language. So I choke up when I think about those sponsors, because how did they have the courage to do what they did? What kind of hearts did they have? It was it was an incredible blessing.
Yeah, that's amazing. So then, when did the idea of a Hope Clinic come about, or was it just waiting for
Oh,
the?
from the very beginning, for this health coalition, we knew we needed to, our goal was my goal for that. And I know there were other goals, but my big goal for the coalition, and I was leading it at the time for years, was really, I wanted the providers to be aware of the Asian communities, the diaspora, you know, the the diversities within the Asian communities were not the same. And at that time, that wasn't accurate for, many providers were not aware. And to know how to, so my goal was to educate the providers, to reach out to them, and then um, to make sure that they provided services that was appropriate for the community, that the community needed, and then to make sure we had the data, and then to make sure that that our parents could get these care, because for the most part the kids were getting, they could speak. The parents and the older people were not able to speak. So I think from the beginning we had this dream from the very beginning of the coalition. We want this coalition to culminate in this dream, that we're going to have a community health center that can serve the community, that, in a way that's helpful for us.
I understand it began with 4 hours of a week in a building, right? And then did you stay involved during the whole time? And were you were you actually in the clinic, or were you helping in the background and make sure that everything was set up?
I was more in the background. Beverly had the church connection, and I think that Beverly was able to get the one of the cardiologists at her church to volunteer. And oh my goodness, I remember he would run over to the Chinese Community Center once a month. It was once a month after clinic, and he would see patients, and the Chinese Community Center, and even then was so supportive, and they gave us a small room, and we would take the tables out of the closet and we would open it up in this small room, and there were volunteers to translate. But because the doctor was Chinese Americans, I think we had more Chinese Americans come. And because it was in the Chinese Community Center, many Vietnamese American felt, oh, that's not for me, it's for the Chinese. So because we had that, and we didn't have a Vietnamese doctor volunteer, and I didn't have those connections. So, and I really learned about that people don't think something is for them because of the place where it's in, right? Because of the languages available. So it was open like one day a month, and then it came to one day a week. But it was one day a month for a bit, and we, I would think it was $5 a visit, because we figured they must be able to afford $5. And so we did the translation, and I mean, Katrina really just kind of put us on the map, because then we had a lot of Vietnamese American doctors volunteer, and they came from California, and they came from many places. And I mean, Beverly and Regine would have better numbers, but I do remember that we were at one point at our clinic that was not even a clinic, it was within a little room within a community center. We were seeing the most Asian patients of any of the clinics in Texas. I mean, because they all came to our clinic, and they had a station at the Hong Kong market, and people were coming in from Louisiana, and a lot of them were Vietnamese, and they needed care. So it was amazing how that everybody came together, the community came together to help. Um, it's crazy.
That is fascinating. So the
Oh,
clinic, yeah.
one more thing I think about, if I may interrupt. Um, Thinking about, when people think, is this place for me? Is this service for me? I remember talking with Chi Mei Lin at the Chinese Community Center. And I remember her telling me a story about when they did the driver's ed program and they implemented that. And it was all Chinese Americans that came for the driver's ed. They had a government grant to do it. But then they got a girl to answer the phones, and that girl was actually bilingual in Chinese and Vietnamese. And then all of a sudden, it's like more than 80% of the class became Vietnamese. So, that's the importance of language where people feel, okay, it is, they speak Vietnamese, I can attend, or it is welcoming for me. So just, it's not enough to look Asian. You kind of have to feel like it's okay for me to go.
So when that one 4-hour visit once a month happened in the Chinese Community Center, did that begin after you collected the data? Was this something that you needed to do only? What is the connection? I'm not too clear on. Why do we need the data to be able to have this service?
Well, no, we needed the data just to lobby for the city of Houston to collect and report on Asian health. We needed the data for other government institutions to start collecting Asian health data and to report it out. And they always said it was too small. So even when I started at MD Anderson, I had to kind of really lobby to the the Texas Cancer Registry and the Texas Association of Demographers, because they reported data for Texas, for African Americans, for whites, for Hispanics, but no Asians. And they always said it's too small to be statistically valid. But I said, you just have to. You have to. And we were always, calling and asking for data. And so now, you can get Asian data from the Texas Cancer Registry. The Texas demographics people collect, like, report out for Asians, because you can't report on cancer data if you don't have the population data, because then you can't produce a rate. So you need to have the population data reported out, right? So that was, kind of that connection. So we needed to have other people to be aware of the issue, to be aware of the challenges, and to address it in their own capacity, because that's what they're responsible for. And that's what we pay with our tax monies.
Right. So then, once this clinic was established, and you're saying Katrina really put the clinic on a map, that people got to know about it, and then other non-Asian, but non-Chinese, but other Asian groups came to seek medical help. Um, when did it become what it is, what we know? Even how did it get its office on Corporate Drive in that building, and then from there from the story from when it grew from the corporate campus to other campuses, I think we have captured in the other interviews, but just the beginning, if you could just
Yeah.
touch a little bit
So
upon it.
this is where we use the data. So because we did have data on Asian behavior, Asian beliefs, Asian, some of that data we used when we write grants. So we were writing, because when you write grants, you have to describe the population. And if we can't get that description anywhere, we can't even get it for the health of Houston. So we used what we had through the Opening Doors Project So we used that to write the grants too. So we got our first grant was like a $25,000 grant from Aetna, I remember. And so from that grant, we built on, some projects and um, so getting those grants, using the data that we had to keep building. And then we started thinking, well, we need to apply for at least FQHC lookalike status, but the state health department didn't have Asian data. So, and it was interesting because to apply for this, you had to even demonstrate that you're in a medically underserved area or a medically underserved population. How can you show that you're medically underserved population if you don't have any data on your population? Right? They weren't collecting that. And the state health department were not collecting it in the Southwest area. So they weren't even looking at it. Texas is a big state. We know that. And they've got their eyes in different places, right? But they can't be everywhere at once. But it took a concerted effort by just and the more you find out, then the more you realize needs to be done. And the more you realize you can do it very effectively as a bigger group. You can have a bigger voice, you can have a heavier weight to your words. So we really lobbied within the Texas State Department of Health. They had an office to determine area. So in order for them to even go out and pull the data that they needed to pull to demonstrate that an area was medically underserved or it's short of health providers, they had to do a lot of things and they didn't have the data to pull it. So we kind of really pushed and prodded until they did that. And we were able to show, okay, so we were able to go for the MUP, the medically underserved population. And, and just applying, we applied so much often, and we would meet after work, Beverly, Rogine, and I, and we would write different sections of the grant. And at that time, you had to do 10 copies of everything. And it was, we just kind of chip in our monies and we made the copies, and it had to be mailed before midnight and whatever date. And we would be driving downtown to the downtown post office, which was at the, it's no longer there, but the downtown post office. And we'd be dropping off our 10 packages of documents. But we actually were not successful in getting, so we realized we needed a professional grant writer. Because this, and that's another thing. These big federal grants, they're asking community people to do things that we didn't have the background and the information to do. We knew the needs, but if you have reviewers that don't, we could be evaluating different things, right? So that's one thing I'm really encouraged about now that I see with cancer grants, where they bring in reviewers who are advocates, who are patients, who are community members to help review the grants. Because unless you review it from that perspective, you don't realize that these grants are not going to be helpful. So, you've got to have from different perspectives, and you've got to have researchers coming from these communities with these different perspectives and understandings in order to do research that is appropriate for the community and that's meaningful and relevant for the community. And you can only do that if you have diverse participants in every category.
That is so true. So we have another half an hour or a little bit left to discuss all of your amazing career. So if there's something else you'd like to talk to us about Hope Clinic, please do. But I'd like to move on, especially to the work that you're doing now, directing the Minority of Women Clinical Trials Recruitment Program, MD Anderson, and then also addressing the systemic bias and racism in the healthcare system. All of these are absolutely so timely, so important. But if there's something else you'd like to talk about Hope Clinic, and then we can move on to, or is there something else you would prefer to talk about in your career? We'd love to hear it.
Sure, and just a kind of a little more of a brief background. I feel very fortunate to So when I went to, right after graduating from the School of Public Health with my master's, I was able to work in research for 2 years. So I really had an understanding of the research, and that really informed my thinking as well as informed my rebellion. But having the research background, and then I was able to go to United Way, where I really got the perspective from the community in terms of funding and kind of resources and how do you assess community programming, which I had learned in my studies at the School of Public Health, but not an actual real life practice, and seeing how that worked and seeing how to allocate the money equitably and fairly, and who is involved in the board is so important. Learning all of that and learning about that diversity, because if you have chairman of the boards on your board, sure, you're able to bring in a lot of money, but does that mean that all your monies go to the big organizations that everyone knows about? The Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the big organizations. What about, I mean, is it your job also to incubate these smaller community organizations that really know the needs of these smaller groups? So really I felt like I was able to bring that voice to the United Way process, to listen to the smaller groups. So maybe sometimes it is our job to incubate because they are able to address these needs that we're not aware of. And then from the United Way, I was able to move. And I feel very fortunate because in these moves, I wasn't looking for the opportunity, but people would approach me and ask me to apply for the position. So I was able to go to a managed care company that was created by the Memorial Hermann system and the Sisters of Charity healthcare system. It was two healthcare systems that came together and created a managed care company. And they felt like it was very hard for them to work with insurers, like the big insurers who cut their prices, and it was, so they wanted to create their own insurance company. And so I learned things from the managed care perspective. I learned about HEDIS, about quality tools, about all of these things in the managed care. So I had a good grounding in that, and also a good understanding of how difficult it is at that time to use the managed care data sets for health research, because the data was not collected in that way. It was collected for billing. And so in order to do research, you've got to collect data differently for research. So at that time, that was, Kaiser was the lead in that. And I was very impressed with what Kaiser was doing in reporting and all of this. But the research piece was beyond my little healthcare company that was newly formed. And it's actually now defunct. We're not able to maintain it. But from there, I went to Memorial Hermann itself and worked in strategic planning. So I got a background in hospital planning, and I did the strategic planning piece for the Hermann Children's Hospital and Memorial Southwest. Those were my two groups, and really always bringing in the community perspective to the planning perspective, because we can get caught up in our little picture inside the building, and we forget to include this big picture and these drivers that we're not seeing. And so having the hospital perspective, and then from there, I was invited to apply for a job at MD Anderson. And going back into, I mean, it's the hospital system, but getting to do community stuff within a hospital system. So it's like a merging of that, and having that experience. All of this has really, affected how I view the world. And I'm so fortunate. And so I've actually been at MD Anderson for the longest. All of my other jobs have lasted maybe 3 years. And then something would happen and I would get invited to apply. And now I've been here 20 years and I have no interest in leaving. I love what I'm doing. And I'm always doing new things and learning new things. So it's just always fun. So that's kind of all the things that drives me. But at MD Anderson, we have I work in a center for community engaged translational research. And that is working with communities to do research with the community to, obviously we make fun of this, but we don't do drive-by research, right? We do research with the community where the community, our partners have a voice in what we're doing. And we look to them for wisdom. It really bothers me in health education promotion theory. I think sometimes we think of communities as this open vessel, waiting for smart people to pour in information and knowledge. And then they're going to change their behavior because once they know tobacco is bad for you, right? And it's not the case. You have to figure out what is it. I mean, sometimes you have to accept a cigarette because your friend is offering it to you and it's a token of friendship. You don't turn down something like, just like you go to someone's house and they offer you something, some food, you do, sometimes you do want to accept because you don't want to turn people down. So just I love being able to connect our researchers to the communities in an equitable way, because researchers can be selfish. And I say that because they don't intentionally mean to be selfish, but they are focused on their question. They're focused on what they need to get the questions answered, to get the research done. So they're not really thinking about, they're thinking about what they need first and foremost. They're not thinking about what the partner needs and what's in it for them. Because researchers always think often is, of course, this is important. Of course, the community partner is going to agree that this is important for their population. So I'm sorry, the sun was getting on my head and I was getting hot. But I tell them it's beyond that. If you want the community partner, the organization to collect data for you in a certain way, it's going to require reprogramming. You've got to pay for the time for the analyst, the programmer to reprogram the system. You've got to pay for the time for a community coordinator to do all of this. You cannot expect people to do things for you out of the goodness of their heart. And I'm always trying to get our researchers out into the community because I tell them it's good karma. You got to pay back. You want people to participate in your studies. When's the last time you volunteered? And then those and if they tell me they're too busy, I'm telling them, do you think community members are not busy? They have lives, they have jobs, and they're probably busier than you are. So, and that's another thing is, when a lot of times people talk about marginalized community. I'm so glad that now that these words are no longer acceptable, that we look to the community for wisdom, because the communities themselves know what works for them. They can tell us what helps them. They're not marginalized. They are proud people with a lot of strengths. They've been put in supremely adverse circumstances, but they've managed to do well despite all of that. So to recognize that and to work from that perspective, that it is us that have to learn. We have to learn. It is incumbent upon us to know how to work, to figure out where the people are. I mean, sometimes I've heard a community member say, people say that we're hard to reach communities. I always know where to reach my family and friends and my neighbors. You don't know how to reach us. We're not hard to reach. So that really made an impact on me. And I try not to think of it that way. And we've had some failures actually reaching out to some communities. And part of it is because sometimes it's that those communities are too new. They've got too many other things going on right now. They can't do health promotion, health prevention, or projects that require them to do surveys and advocate to get people, because those leaders are still trying to get their communities to do primary basic stuff for survival. So we having to acknowledge that and figuring that out. I mean, that's hard too. But figuring that out and keeping them on my back burner so that as continuing to grow and foster and support. And that's what communities need. They need to be aware that you're not just out here to use them, to write your grants and get your money and then get your promotions. You're here because you want to see the community thrive. And so my team and I do that, where we are, the researchers are not, of course, they have to do their research, but my teams and I, we're out there and we're meeting with the communities. We're helping participate. We help them with program planning. We serve on their committees. We serve on the boards. It's a lot of time. And a lot of those times were in the evenings, weird hours. Sometimes we're compensated, sometimes we're not, because if it's in the evenings, we just do what we need to do. And so that's one of the things that I've learned, is to hire people passionate about community, because they're going to do what it takes and they're going to be creative and clever. And I've also learned that we've got to hire people whose enthusiasm and who kind of was a little bit of a salesman, because you've got to sell health. I mean, if we're not selling health like Coca-Cola is selling Coke, how are we going to get people to change behavior? And this came to me because I was in a meeting in Dallas, at a public health meeting with the health department. I was on a subcommittee group, and it was a big meeting room, and it was extremely boring. It was quiet, and everybody's kind of like just discussing things. And in the next room next to us, it was another bar room. You know how they separate the bar rooms into two? There was so much cheering going on. There was laughter. There was so much energy and enthusiasm. And our room was dead that we're talking about health. So I snuck out. I went over to the other room. You know what it was? It was a Mary Kay meeting. Those women know how to sell health. Right? They're selling cosmetics, but you've got to sell health with the same enthusiasm you're selling all these other people who are successful. We can't be talking about theories. We've got to talk, so that's been my thinking and my approach to how I do my projects. If you can't sell health like Coca-Cola or Mary Kay or any of these people that are successfully selling their products, or Philip Morris, we're not going to be able to do what we do. But you know what? We can connect with the community. We can show our communities we care, and we can be intentional in how we research with them.
That's brilliant. So we only have like 13 minutes left. I want to know a little bit more about your family, and then also anything that you're so proud, looking back on your amazing career, that you want to let our audience and future researchers know. You have 13 minutes to choose whatever you want to talk about. It's been a fascinating interview.
So so my parents have 3 kids. So I have 2 brothers and me, and I have one, but they're both engineers, and I think it's because at that time, us growing up, you had to become like a profession, so to help the family. So they became engineers because that's what boys do. So it's very stereotypical. And I met my husband at University of Houston. He was in his last year of architecture, and I was in my first year, and I was working in work study at the architecture school. So we met, and then we started dating. So we became engaged, and I got married at 22, which is quite early among my peer group. And so I had my child when I was 28, and he is now 26 years old. It's so we have one child, and my husband started his own architecture design build firm, and he works in architecture for quite a bit. And then he wanted to do something different, and he sold his business, and he bought a coffee farm in Hawaii. So now we're coffee farmers part-time. And I didn't know anything about coffee farming, but he said, don't worry, we can YouTube it. And we did. So we love growing things. We love gardening, and in Hawaii everything grows. So we do go quite often, and now it's much easier because I work from home, except that in Hawaii, I work like from 2 a.m. to 12 p.m. because I'm working Houston time still. Um, but it's been an awesome ride. And you know, my husband has taken so many risks where he started new businesses all the time. Like right now he has a restaurant. He built his own restaurant right on in the museum district at Southmore. Called it Java Lava Brew. So that, you know, it's a Hawaiian restaurant. It features coffee from our farm, Kona coffee. You know, it's just this awesome coffee. And then with the pandemic, he sold the restaurant, but then we recently got invited back into to the Asia Society, right? And again, on the same street, because they loved our food. And my husband really didn't want to go back because he's like, I think I'm retired. I'm enjoying this. But they just made us an awesome offer. And, and they are such a good group. They're phenomenal people. So and it's limited hours. It's a lot less work than before. So we are now back, Java Lava Cafe, in the Asia Society, and you know, got lots of excellent food. And I come out and help on the weekends. And actually, it's fun because I sometimes talk to our customers about clinical trials. I talk to them about why is it so important that minorities have to participate in clinical, and they're eating their poke and, and drinking their golden oat milk, and they have to listen to me. So, and I did that at the old restaurant too. And you know, at the old restaurant, we actually had quite a lot of African American patrons. And, you know, then of course, that was my audience. And I'm like, you know, we really have to have African Americans on clinical trials. And that's what I do. And this is why. And, you know, and I explain and people listen to me. And so we do educational sessions at our old restaurant. And now we haven't done it because we've just moved into this new restaurant, but I'd love to do more of that. So that's, you know, so our son is now, you know, on his own. He's fully grown. He's working full time. He's got a new job. He's just transitioned. He's going to, he's a programmer. And one of the passions that I talk about, I do a lot of training at MD Anderson, is on plain language, because language access is so critical. And people don't realize that, you know, linguists say that at 10,000 words, you have learned a new language. You can speak fluently in that language. And people don't realize you go through med school, you pick up 15,000 new words. And that means the average doctor has learned a new vocabulary, a new language, and they forget that they're speaking a different language than us. And particularly for people who are not in the healthcare field, and particularly for people who are stressed out, our literacy goes down. Even if you have a PhD in nuclear medicine, you're not a cancer doctor, right? You're not, this is not your space. It's like when you talk to a programmer, like I talk to my son, or when I talk to a gamer, that's not my space. Or even an auto mechanic, right? That's not my space. There are many words I don't understand. There are many concepts I don't understand. So I do a lot of training for our doctors, our nurses, our pharmacists, and I do it for the other community groups as well. And to RICE groups, the students, to inoculate them who are interested in health careers, to speak in plain language. And so there are strategies to do that. And I go over those strategies. So that is one of my passions, is to, you know, get people to speak in plain language so that people have access to healthcare and they can make the informed decisions for themselves.
That is so great. Well, I have so many questions, but you call yourself a rebel, and how do you see yourself as a rebel?
Um, Gosh, I guess I'm more of an activist. I've always, I'm always supporting the underdog, and the underdog is usually the small communities who don't have a voice. And knowing that I cannot be the voice, recognizing that there are many voices to any community. So, and I'm always, you know, I often do I play the devil's advocates, even for myself, because I know nothing is black and white. There's many shades of gray. and to be able to recognize that and to be able to kind of figure out what is it that I don't know. Um, I want to keep that field kind of small. Like if I don't know something, then at least I should know that I don't know it. And so, but I guess these days I'm not so much a rebel anymore because I'm older and I'm tireder. I now I'm very just right now I think I'm more focused on the plain language and bringing that equity to the care to make sure that our patients understand what we mean when we say a stage, a cancer stage, when we just say all the words that we toss about and we don't even think of it as jargon, but it truly is, and making sure that their voices are heard. So in that sense, and my other passion is swimming. So I came over when I didn't know how to swim, and the ocean was a very scary place. My mother is very scared of the ocean, and this is actually an experience that we share with many people in the African American community who suffer the highest rates of childhood drowning. So for many minority women, we don't know how to swim. So I actually have attended like 5 swimming programs, drop out of 5 swimming programs unsuccessfully. And then one year, my brother-in-law entered my family into a race, a triathlon. And there were 3 parts in a triathlon. There's a swimming part, and then there's a biking and a running part. And my family said, well, you're the one with the most swimming experience. You be the swimmer. But they didn't. I mean, I kept telling, but I dropped out. I didn't learn how to swim, but I had the most experience. So I had to learn how to swim really quick to learn to do 1,000 meters when I didn't know how to swim across the pool. But fortunately, I was able to hook up with a coach who was a triathlon coach, which is different because the other teachers I had to attend were swimming teachers. And this coach was teaching people how to swim effectively, efficiently, because after you swim, you still have to bike and then you still have to run. So I think in one lesson, he taught me, and I was able to get across the pool. And in that summer, and like in 3 months, I was able to do 1,000 meters. And it was a lot of work on my part. And then I just love it so much because it's freedom. It's meditation. I'm with my breath. I'm with my body when I'm swimming. There's nothing else. And I became a coach. I took the coaching class, and I really just want to help people, especially minorities and women, how to swim. So that's one of my next goals for my retirement life is to volunteer somewhere and help. And I actually am on the USMS coaching list. So I've been approached by different people asking for help with swimming, and I've helped them with swimming. And they have been minority women. So it's been very rewarding for me. So.
That's amazing. Thank you. So, are there any other parting wisdom or thoughts you'd like to share with us? We have about 2 minutes. I'm very conscious of your schedule.
um, so I think for people who are younger, who are like me before, you're new, you have a lot of passion, you have a lot of energy. I think the most wonderful thing that you can have is friends to do it with. You can't do it alone. And that's where the path of burnout happens. You've got to, I was so lucky to find Rogine and Beverly, and so, well, there were other people too, but those other people have kind of eventually dropped out of the pictures. But to have Rogine and Beverly by our side, and when I got tired, like when I had my baby and I needed to drop out for about 6 months, they kind of took the lead, and it's kind of like, birds flying, right? They take turns taking the lead, and having that support group is just so powerful. And it really helps you keep your strength up. So having, just your peeps, your homebodies to do things with, it makes it fun. I can't say enough about that. And it's been an incredible journey with Rogine and Beverly. So
Well, thank you. It's been such a wonderful interview, and I hope that you will allow us to come back to you sometime when you have more time, we have more questions to perhaps continue the conversation and to see what you do in the next chapter of your life.
For sure. And come out to the coffee shop.
We'll do that for sure. Okay, well, thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure and honor to learn your story.
And it was a pleasure to meet you. Thank you, Anne. Take
Thank you.
care.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.